Okay, I went ahead and pushed record. Should I wait?
You can go ahead if you like.
Okay. And just tell me when to actually start.
Okay, well, welcome everyone to the Natural Hazard Speaker Series. Today we have Jaimie Masterson from Texas A&M. She was supposed to travel to meet us, and I'm going to mute that person. Or maybe you can mute it. I can't mute it, Jaimie, anymore.
Okay.
So she is author on the book Planning for Community Resilience, along with several others. You heard last week Paula Shea mention the scorecard, so it's a good introduction to where we are today. So feel free to take it away.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. I'm a little bummed that I'm not there in person, but I'm very honored to be a presenter for your group and your class, and there's so much amazing stuff happening in this field in North Carolina. So I feel I'm excited to share with you some stuff that we've been working on. Again, I'm Jaimie Hicks Masterson. I am Associate Director of a program we have called Texas Target Communities, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But also the Director of Engagement for the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center, which is one of the top 3 research centers on hazards in the United States. And I'm glad to be a part of Texas A&M University. So I'm going to talk about our book that we wrote in 2008, but then I'm going to kind of weave in what we've learned since then and applied in many of the communities in Texas. So also feel free, if I'm not going to really be monitoring the chat box, but feel free to ask questions, or if you have a question, you can put in the chat box and maybe Shailene can kind of chime in for us. But I'm going to go ahead and get started. Oh, how do I? Okay. Okay. So this is Texas. If you're not familiar with this state, what you're seeing, basically the book that we wrote in 2008 was based on research from Hurricane Ike. It made landfall in Galveston in September of 2008. And so you can kind of see where Galveston is on the map. And that lighter pink color is essentially the Houston metropolitan area. It's a very sprawling city, and I'm bummed that the National Planning Conference won't be hosted there this year. There's, I think, a lot to learn from the mistakes they've made in the past, but some of the things that they're doing now. And just to give you a sense, also the state has been growing significantly over the years, and I'm not sure if you know, but we have states. 3 of our cities are in the top 10 list of most populous. So Houston's number 4, San Antonio's number 7, Dallas is number 9, and then just outside of the top 10 list, we have Austin, number 11 most populous city, and then Fort Worth, the 13th most populous city. So there's a lot of people in our state, and unfortunately, a lot are exposed to various hazards. This is a zoom in of the Houston-Galveston area, and this is essentially the track for Hurricane Ike in 2008. So the loops that you're seeing, the roads around, those are the various loops that encircle Houston and are across Houston. And Galveston Island is the barrier island that kind of protects that bay, which is Galveston Bay. And the track that you're seeing basically went all the way up the bay and into what's called the Houston Ship Channel, which is one of the largest ports in the U.S. and home to one of the largest petrochemical facilities in the world. So you can see here the storm surge and a lot of folks that are vulnerable hurricanes and flooding in particular. You know, but Galveston is used to hazards, right? If you know your history, our nation's most catastrophic natural disaster happened in Galveston, on Galveston Island, called the 1900 storm. And if you've ever read the book Isaac's Storm, it's a really great kind of fiction, but like true to like a historical fiction book about what happened in the coming days and the aftermath of the 1900 storm. Somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 people died. And here are just some photos of the destruction. Because of that hurricane, they erected a 16-foot high seawall, which you can see on the top right. And they physically rose the island. So that bottom picture with a man pointing to a pole at the top, he is pointing to a line, and they rose the homes, and then they filled it all in with soil. And so that the picture next to it is him pointing to that same line, but it's now on the ground. So the island, you know, while protected by the seawall, it's, you know, it still is not enough. It's a barrier island, right? And that statue on the bottom left corner is a memorial to the 1900 storm, and it was erected in memory of those lives lost. So, so here we are. This is 2008, back to Ike, and that's that same statue that sits actually on top of that 16-foot high seawall. And it's not muted, so make sure y'all are muted. And essentially, this was a very catastrophic storm. This was before Sandy, but after Katrina, after Rita, and after some of the other big ones. At the time, it was the third costliest disaster. And it had a 22-foot storm surge, and but really the destruction, it overtopped the seawall, but a lot of the destruction and the storm surge came from the bay side. But even still, even though the city had gone through the 1900 storm and other storms between then and 2008, they still did not have specific actions within their hazard mitigation plan. They did not mention hazards in their comprehensive plan, and they did not have any sort of recovery plan in place. So, you know, vulnerable, but not necessarily planning for it. You can see in one of the pictures there, just slab on grade of an apartment complex, very common on the island. And you can see also the beach house there, where, you know, built to stronger building codes and was able to withstand more of the storm. And I'm assuming that a lot of you know that, you know, all types of disasters are increasing in frequency and magnitude. And so this is probably not a surprise chart for you to see. But the thing is we treat disasters as these acute events. Instead, they are really more chronic problems, part of our chronic conditions. And we talk in the book about how natural disasters are really far from natural phenomena. Of course, they are a part of our biophysical systems, and those systems are changing due to climate change. But it's really this interaction of our biophysical systems and us, humans, and the built environment, and all of those kind of coalescing together, which really causes what we know as a disaster. And it's really the function of human action, or as we like to think, our own inaction. So you probably know and have a definition of resilience in your minds, and that has really come from the field of ecology, thinking about ecosystems and their ability to respond and bounce back and survive ultimately. And in the 90s, the hazards and disaster literature began using the term resilience to describe how communities and households and individuals can also bounce back. Here's another kind of visual way to describe what resilience really is. So the sort of line is the sort of baseline community function. And when the disaster hits, there's a shock. So the community is functioning at a lower capacity. It's not functioning as well, but how robust is it and how quickly is it able to get back to its baseline and kind of recover, bounce back to that baseline. But ultimately, resilience is not just about getting back to where you were, but adapting and allowing for enhancements and, ultimately mitigating the disasters and lessening your risk altogether. So you've probably also are aware of there are 4 phases to a disaster. So we have disaster preparedness, which is, the emergency managers are and the first responders are preparing for the event itself. They're getting equipment and thinking about all the different components of what might be entailed in an event. Then there's the actual response. So there's the sort of search and rescue, saving lives, getting folks out of direct harm's way. And then there's the recovery, so the rebuilding, getting back to that basic functioning level. And then the fourth part of this phase is hazard mitigation, which is the things that we can do to lessen our risk and altogether. So you can think about the preparedness and the response is very focused on the event itself. It's very event specific. But really, the disaster recovery and hazard mitigation is really all about the built environment. And so kind of the argument in our book is that planners, land use planners, and others that deal with the built environment need to be a part of and thinking about disasters in everything that they do. So you can think about it this way as well. I like to think of it in sort of this timeline. So we have the disaster event, the moment the disaster hits. And then there's a short window of response, that's saving the lives, right? Then we have a longer window for short-term recovery. So those are maybe weeks, maybe months of getting folks into shelters and getting them safe. And then the long-term recovery of really rebuilding and getting things back to where they were. Everything before the disaster is kind of about planning and what ways we can plan and then be consistent across our plans and have our plans integrated. And hopefully you've seen the main thrust of this whole diagram is mitigation, and the fact that mitigation can and should be woven through and a part of every step and every phase, because what can we be doing now to lessen our risk and our vulnerability altogether? So in our book, we talk about the importance of planning, about what planners can be doing, but other fields can certainly be using the same process. And you're probably familiar, if you're in planning, that there is a process. There's a method to how we do planning. So this is our method, which is not probably dissimilar from what you've seen before. And I've adapted it slightly to kind of emphasize a few things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this process and talk about it through the lens of some of our communities that we've worked with in Texas. Okay, so, and please, again, feel free if I'm going too fast or if you have questions to please ask those. So there's this program at Texas A&M called Texas Target Communities, and we work with low capacity communities to help them with planning needs in particular, or other needs that go unmet in these communities. And we do it through high impact service learning. So we are engaging communities, but we are also engaging courses and students on our campus. And it's been around since 1993 formally, and it's really the brainchild of our Department of Landscape Architecture and Urban Planning. But in 2012, they hired John Cooper, which is our director of our program. And then in 2013, they brought me on, and it was essentially the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center that funded my position. And the idea was, let's help those places, low capacity, that are also exposed to a variety of hazards. And unfortunately, that's really easy to do in Texas. There's lots of hazards that our communities are exposed to, and planning is not the most popular thing to do in Texas. Okay, and a lot of our low capacity places just aren't doing planning. So, but that's a map of all the places we've worked over the many years. And the book is there because we really are applying what's in the book in these places. And our whole mission is to facilitate the transformation of communities from high risk or low opportunity to equitable, resilient, and adaptive. And we want to do that by mitigating threats to economy, environment, and culture. And so we try to be holistic about this. We don't want to just focus on specific things, but we want to think about all the things that communities should think about: social, economic, and natural capacities that they have, or capital that they have, as well as the civic, human, and physical capital they might have. And we do this by through training, equipping them with tools, and mostly through assisting them in our courses with our students on campus. And this is very much community driven. It is not just giving them a study or throwing them a plan. It is participatory, it is inclusive, and we like to say, and you probably know the end of this statement: if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. So we work very hard to try to get participation from the community and participation from all parts of the community. So I'm going to walk you through what we did with Rockport. We worked with the city of Rockport last year. Rockport, you probably don't know if you're not from Texas, but it's a cherished and loved little tiny community on the Texas coast. It's kind of a funky, artsy community, and it's got this kind of coastal charm. And the trees, you can see the trees there, they all slant at a 45-degree angle because of just the coastal breeze and the wind from the Gulf of Mexico. Rockport was where Hurricane Harvey in 2017 made landfall. And while I know North Carolina has faced very similar disasters to Harvey, it just the sheer volume and destruction across the state was so extreme. And so it made landfall at Rockport. You can kind of see it on the map where it made landfall. Well, it went back out into the Gulf of Mexico, and then it sat over Houston for many, many days. It went back out into the Gulf, and then it sat for a few more days on top of the Beaumont, Port Arthur area. So all of that was just underwater, but Rockport experienced more of a wind event as opposed to a storm surge or a rain event. And as soon as it went to Houston, many in Texas just forgot all about Rockport. So they came to us. They asked us that they asked us to come, and they needed help. But essentially 20% of the population was lost. A quarter of the structures were destroyed, and another quarter were very significantly damaged. They lost all of their multifamily housing, and their city hall and their county courthouse was also destroyed. So they, again, like I said, they asked us to come. Right before the storm, they were already planning to do and go through a comprehensive planning process. So they asked us, they said, look, we already wanted to do this. Our comp plan is already very out of date. And now we think it's the right time, and we can think about hazards in the way that we need to be thinking about hazards. So we worked with several courses on our campus. So everything that's kind of outlined there in the black are actually student courses that participated with the city. There was a course also at our campus in Corpus Christi. Ours a course with our law school, and we also had a course with Texas Tech University. So we partnered across the universities. We had 4 public meetings across, well, they have not officially adopted the plan, so it's been about a 20-month process, but the main thrust of the planning process took about 12 months, and we had 4 public meetings, and at any one of those public meetings, we had 130 participants. They had 2 leadership trainings, and we had a special subcommittee or task force. We worked very closely with Texas Sea Grant on the project, and they were instrumental in executing the process. And you can see some of the various topics that we covered in our conversations with the community. But what do we do when we work with our communities? So the first thing you do, and you should do, is to get organized and work with what we call a core team. So our program coordinator, G. Thapa, she was the main project manager for this, this effort. And she had basically bi-weekly calls with Amanda Torres there. You see her in the picture in the front. She's the planner and floodplain manager of a very, very small staff, city staff. So she's the one person. But she's a rock star. And I'd love her to talk to you all as well. That she's got so much knowledge in a very short amount of time, has gained a lot of knowledge. But in our experience, when you decide to work with a community, this person is a critical piece. So you want to find a person who has decision-making authority, who can give you timely answers and can deploy resources as needed. And then most importantly, has some sort of reputational capital and equity to gather folks together. So she was that person. And like Amanda said in this quote here, it's important for us, the community, it was important for them to look at how they wanted to grow over these next 20 years, especially with Hurricane Harvey so fresh in their minds. So they were willing, they were ready, and so we organized this effort. Okay, so, but you don't want to just work with city staff or elected officials, right? And sometimes we encourage elected officials not to participate. We want to really hear from residents and community members. But the next step is you really need to get together and form a task force, a diverse group that represents the various communities within the community. And it doesn't have to be a large committee. Of course, this was a small community, right? It was less than 10,000 in population, but the larger the community, maybe it could be a larger group, but it needs to be a manageable size to have tough, deep conversations with. And again, in our experience, it needs to be diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, age, and interests in the community. So we actually have our task force sign, like come up with ground rules and sign, like it's a voluntary contract, basically committing to the process and committing to be really a conduit of information to the public. And they also are very important in getting the word out to folks. And so this is probably the most and critical group and piece of the whole effort is who is on this committee, on this task force, and the makeup of this group. Because we believe that, just like Mark Holman says, that an organized effort with many people acting powerfully and confidently is far more effective than one strong leader. And you're probably wondering, how do we do this? This is the hardest part typically, right? So the important part, as you're thinking about resilience and wanting to plan for, help communities plan for resilience, is building the right team. So in any community, you have those movers and shakers. you have those who maybe are more privileged, maybe have more assets, maybe have more power. And, you know, we still want those folks to participate if they're willing to participate, right? But we need to actively seek and involve those who are moved and shaken, okay? And by the way, this chart comes from MDC, which is a nonprofit, actually very close to you in Durham, North Carolina. John Cooper, our director, he worked there for many, many years. So our whole process very much has evolved from MDC. And so he even told me before I came on for this presentation, like, well, just have them call MDC up and tell them that, you know John Cooper, or you heard him, or you know him in some sort of tangential way. So there's that. If you want to learn more about how to do this in North Carolina, they're the ones to go to. But anyways, moved and shaken. So we want to figure out how to get to those who probably lack power in the community and feel disconnected, maybe feel jaded in the process. So we want to figure out how can we connect to them and those who are also willing. And the way we do that is by really working closely with this middle third group, okay? This group that is trusted in the community, or maybe there's folks who are trusted, particular people who are trusted in the community. Typically, they're like pastors or teachers or folks that come from nonprofit organizations. But there's usually someone who is a champion and who can bridge both sides, who is trusted by the movers and shakers and those who are moved and shaken. And oftentimes they're so trusted that they can bring in the moved and shaken as a part of that of the effort. So I can give you examples if you have questions, but one we like to say, Ronnie McDonald, who was the president of the Texas Rural Leadership Program, he talked about his mom who worked at the local Dairy Queen in the very small town he grew up in. And she knew everyone in town because everyone went to the Dairy Queen. Yes, this is like your prototypical Texas story. But because of that, everyone loved her, everyone knew her, everyone trusted her. So she would be a really good example of someone that we would want to pull into our task force or committee to help guide the process. Okay, so those community champions and those who are trusted. So yes, and you can also, a lot of this information is also comes from Collective Impact. So if you're interested in community engagement, I strongly encourage you to check out that website. And we're also writing a book forthcoming this summer about how to do engaged research, and we talk about our process in that book. Okay. The next thing you do is you assess, okay, the community. You look at pertinent data, and and typically this is what planners know as a state of community report, right? You're looking at demographics and economic data and housing data. Obviously, it's also important to do a vulnerability assessment. So this is the point where we brought in the students in the courses. So that picture is one of the courses in front of the sort of iconic Rockport Strong picture from the community. And the students essentially were able to do a full vulnerability assessment and state of community report, and basically collecting all the baseline data that are necessary that act as that fact basis and as a foundation for decision making. So the way to conduct a vulnerability assessment is essentially you're layering a bunch of different information. The first layers that you're wanting to know about are what hazards you're exposed to. So there's lots of different hazards. You can think about natural hazards, but also I think technological hazards, and thinking about environmental justice is also important here. Here are just some examples from the Houston-Galveston area in terms of surge and floodplains. Here is Rockport's flood zones, and what everything in red and purple is kind of what they are exposed to, and then around the region, what they're exposed to. So you take those hazard layers, and the best way to do this is in GIS, but you don't have to. Oh, and here's one more example. I pulled from Liberty County, Texas. We worked with them a few years ago. I like this one because it shows the floodplain, the 1% chance, the 100-year floodplain. But we also did a bathtub model, and everything in the dark blue is sort of what the future floodplain might look like in year 2100. And we showed this to this very rural community, and we had conversations about, well, you know, if this does occur, in knowing this information, how do we want to guide development away from what this future risk might be? So we had some conversations around that. So you take that information, and then you want to overlay it with things in your community that you might be physically vulnerable. And the critical things here are, well, they're the critical facilities. There are things that are important in a response. There are things like your hospitals, your fire department, police department, other community facilities, okay, schools. And then other things, you can continue to look at all sorts of other critical infrastructure and kind of overlay that with different hazard zones. But we also have a couple more examples on this map. We identified work locations in Galveston Island, and we got that data from onthemap.gov, which is an online mapping product from the census, but it's a great tool. As well as we've mapped historic places in Galveston Island. That's a whole nother headache for communities that have structures that are on the National Register. They're on Galveston Island after Hurricane Ike. They had to hand sift through debris to find, you know, the piece of wood that was from the home that was built in 1875 or whatever. So those things are an added level of complexity that you don't often think about when you think about disasters, but it's something you should as you're planning for it in your community. And then the final layer that you overlay is thinking about social vulnerability. And I'm assuming that a lot of you know what social vulnerability is, but we know that there are differences in capacity and information and power and resources in our communities. And that creates disparities in response, but certainly in recovery. And whatever it is, whatever the inequities are in your community, they're only going to be exacerbated in and after a disaster. So we want to understand where populations are that might be more socially vulnerable, and that way we can be providing resources to them. We like to think about them in this way. So not just demographic characteristics, which are important, but what I really like to look at is that second order information. So it's about, like, for instance, let me move this thing here. It's about looking at, let's say, the percent who are single parent households, but also the percent of families that have children under the age of 5, okay? Those people are going to have childcare needs, okay? If we know that these pockets and these neighborhoods are going to have more childcare needs, what kind of resources can we push to those areas, okay? And we think about those now. If my son randomly comes in here, you will recognize that I have a childcare need at the moment. But so it's not just about these demographic characteristics, but it's the stack of these things, the stack of these stressors that kind of add up to different needs. And if we stack all of those needs together, then we kind of have what we call a social vulnerability hotspot. So I'm going to show you how we were able to do it. I'm going to give you a little teaser for what you're going to look hear next week from Phil Burke. How we were able to kind of help prioritize the policies was through a tool that was developed here at Texas A&M by Dr. Phil Burke, who is there now at UNC, called the Plann Integration for Resilience Scorecard. So this is just a teaser. He'll go into more detail on it next week. But here you're seeing essentially two maps from our reading and analysis of plans within the community. So they had about 8 different plans within the community that we read, and we looked through their policies, and they were all saying kind of different things. They were pulling the community in different directions. And so by doing this analysis, it kind of gave us a fact basis for the policies that should be within the comprehensive plan, and probably the policies that we need to tweak and change in a more resilient way within the comprehensive plan. So here's a couple of examples. For instance, they have this heritage master plan, the Heritage District Master Plan. They were talking about how they wanted to develop waterfront property along Water Street. Well, as you can imagine, Water Street is vulnerable to hazards, to flood hazards. So, you know, a good intention, but what about Water Street how can we develop Water Street in a more resilient way? Because adding condominiums and maybe multifamily housing is maybe not the right type of use for that area. Okay, another example came from their long-term recovery plan, which they had just developed after the storm, and it said they wanted the same heritage district to be in a developer-ready zone. They wanted to add utility improvements, and they wanted more housing and economic development in this area. So you could really see, obviously, there was a desire to bring back the economy after the disaster, but it's almost exacerbating or could potentially be creating more vulnerabilities, right? So that's some of the concerns we had in reading through their plans. On the flip side, there were some other things, like for instance, in their hazard mitigation plan that said we should update the zoning regulations to reduce population density in areas vulnerable to hazards. Okay, so it's almost saying the opposite of what those other policies were saying. And it's really good. And so we want to capture that particular policy, and we want to figure out how to fold it into our comprehensive plan, because we know that comprehensive plans talk about future land use, which informs zoning, right? Okay, that if you're not in planning, that's why comprehensive plans are important. Okay, and then this last policy here in their floodplain management plan, they talked about doing property buyouts, open space preservation, and other things. And so we wanted to capture that also and incorporate that into the comprehensive plan. Okay, so we wanted to capture the good things and then talk to the community about the policies we were concerned with and what can we do to tweak them to make them more resilient. Okay, so I'm just showing you this slide because in our research, looking at hazard mitigation plans across Gulf Coast counties and East Coast counties, across the board, the fact basis was the lowest, weakest area within those plans. Inter-organization coordination and capabilities, so that coordination and integration was the weakest within those plans. And also the mitigation policies and actions were the weakest within those plans. Okay, and I hope from this presentation you get that all 3 of those elements probably are the most important and most important things. And the reason why plans are good is because they have strong fact basis, they're coordinated and integrated, and then they have policies, which are really the teeth which make plans happen. Okay, so here from that same research study are all the different types of policies that really can work toward resilience, that if communities are adopting these types of policies, and I'm not going to go into all of these, especially if you're non-planners, you don't need to know all the different types of policies that it can move a community toward resilience, right? But there's a whole toolbox, a whole portfolio of tools that communities can and should be using, and they really don't utilize this full portfolio. So what you're seeing here is basically like communities that really did not adopt these policies, and you can see the highest scoring or the types of policies that communities were most likely adopting or were adopting more of. Everything in yellow are kind of like those development regulations, those land use regulation and management tools that we are often looking at and are important in planning. So those are the types, so to go back, those are the types of policies that we wanted to fold into the Rockport plan and that we tried to fold into the plans that we work with. Okay, and the last stage is, oh, and I think, Bill, are you muted? I can't figure out. I think you're not muted. Let me see if I can. Okay, well, I can't figure out how to do it. So if you can.
Did you want me?
No, you're just unmuted. So if you can mute yourself.
Okay, I'm muting now.
Okay, sorry. Okay, that's okay. We work together all the time. Okay. And okay, so then the next phase is really the implementation phase, and identifying manageable tasks that responsible certain parties in the community, whether in city staff or county or other departments, really can take on to make the plan come alive and not just sit on the shelf. Okay, so here's the comprehensive plan for Rockport. It's such a pretty cover, and which, by the way, that logo came from a community member. So I told you it's a very, it's an artist community. So that logo actually was developed after Hurricane Harvey for the Rockport community as a way to like bring life back and energy and some hope to the community. So we wanted to use that logo for this comprehensive plan because to us it was all about Rockport Strong. So here in the implementation part, this is not like the most exciting part of a plan, right? But it is the most important part of any plan because this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. So here is where every action item and every policy is listed out. When it's going to happen in the short term, medium term, long term, what type of action it is, whether it's a regulation or is it a partnership or is it a program or a capital improvement project, who's responsible for it, so who the action leaders, and of course the funding that they can and should go after to help get to that action. The thing that's in red is an added column that we added for the first time, which was about plan integration. And we wanted to really reiterate that this policy, this action item, also aligns with and comes from this other plan, the long-term recovery plan. And we wanted to do that in order to emphasize to elected officials that by not doing this action item or implementing this policy, then they're also going to be kind of turning their back on these other planning efforts, and to really show them that it's not just this plan's effort, but it's really a fully integrated community-wide vision that it can and should be implemented. So it's our check to make sure that they implement these things. And when you read the plan, which I hope you do in your spare time, which maybe you have more time now, I don't know. I don't, but some people do. If you look and read through the plan, we have all these call out boxes on here's our recommendation, and we're really talking about open space in the floodplain. Oh, and by the way, this plan in the multi-jurisdictional floodplain management plan also talks about open space in the floodplain, or it also talks about it in the mitigation plan, okay, or in the wetlands recommendations. It's also mentioned in the multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan. So it's another way to bring the plan alive and also connect it to the full network of initiatives and efforts that are going on in the community. And then lastly is to monitor and evaluate and update the plan, which obviously Rockport's not there yet. But we think, and I think the way in which the community can monitor their plan is obviously that implementation table. But I think that they could go back through the Plan Integration for Resilience scorecard and kind of rescore their plans. And again, that's a teaser for next week with Phil Burke speaking. But they can go back through and score their plans as a way to monitor how they're doing in moving toward resilience. So I'm kind of like at the end here, and I've got a picture from, the top picture is from Rockport after Hurricane Harvey, and all that was left of that structure was the stoop, right? And then the picture, I hope you recognize that statue from Galveston. Again, that statue is erected on top of that 16-foot seawall. And so kind of the question is always like, is Galveston resilient, or are our communities resilient? And I think it's one of those things that it's not really possible to be resilient. I mean, that's like a very, heavy word, but I think a community can always be moving toward being more resilient. And the way I think we need to be doing that is through city and regional planning. Okay, and I think there are already available tools that planners, public health officials, other disciplines that have maybe taken a back seat in thinking about disasters, there are already available tools that they have that they could be utilizing in their everyday work. And so I'm just going to end it there. So if there are any questions.
So what I would ask is, if you can, when you come to ask questions, turn on your video and speak about it. If you can't, we understand, and we'll get to you on the chat.
And I'm not, I don't know if I see anything in the chat, so let me.
I have a question.
Hi.
Hi, Jaimie. Thanks so much. This has been really great. So I know you talked about how Rockport actually reached out to you all at Target Texas, but can you talk about how some of your other relationships have been established with some of the other communities that you work with, and whether they've been longstanding since the start of the program, or how you guys went about connecting with some other communities?
Right, and that's a good question. We, a few things. Since we've been around since the 90s, we kind of have this sort of like a track record of working well with small communities. And so a lot of times we'll just get cold calls. Oh, I heard that you worked with, Hitchcock, and they spoke really highly of you. Our community needs something similar. So we get a lot of calls like that. I think also because our university is a land grant university, we tend to get communities who recognize that we're kind of charged with working with communities, and so we'll get those calls. So at this point, that's typically how our interactions happen. Now, we also have been able to work with some communities in inner city Houston, and in those ways, and they did not reach out to us, but through the Institute for Sustainable Communities, which Phil Burke led for several years, basically we identified those hotspots, those vulnerable hotspots in parts of Houston. We had some of our own social networks and connections to some nonprofits in the area who were already doing good work on the ground. And so in those areas, in those places, we reach out to them and we say, hey, what do you need help with? What can we assist you with? Not expecting anything in return, but just offering a hand. And typically, you know, that means that we're showing up to random events or random places that are not necessarily an obvious part of our mission, but it allows us to kind of build that trust. And then because of that, they would point us to other groups in the community that we should talk with, that we should build relationships with. So that's how we were able to connect with Tejas, which is an amazing advocacy group, the Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Services. And they connected us to like several high schools in the Houston area. And we worked very closely with the high schools to do similar kind of work. So I think that's what you were kind of getting at. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Jaimie, thanks for this talk today.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you about what you see as some of the biggest opportunities and challenges working in this field. As I think several of us are interested in going into a line of work like this in the near future.
In terms of planning?
Yeah, for like community resilience and personally, like what do you think?
Yes. So opportunities, I think, are really, I guess I'm pretty hopeful. I guess I'm always surprised that municipalities, cities, county governments are not necessarily thinking about hazards in their everyday work. And I think you're seeing that more and more, unfortunately, as we have more and more disasters. But I don't necessarily think big fancy resilience plan is the answer. I think it is about folding in and thinking about resilience in every little piece that you do in your job, and being that person in the room that says, oh, you know, have we thought about the floodplain, or have we thought about this particular hazard, or, oh, have we thought about this particular community that is, you know, more at risk or more vulnerable for these different reasons. And just being that person in the room to ask that question is really powerful. And someone told me once, like, oh, I just wish there were some federal policy that would push down and make communities do this. But local communities just aren't doing it. And I guess I come from a place where, and because I work with local communities, that it's so empowering to be that person in the community that can make big changes just by doing like little things, you know. So I guess I kind of always am about like the little guy, and so I see opportunities in that, and kind of being like an evangelist for what can you do in your job, you know, to weave and think about resilience of these different things. But then I guess the greatest challenges that we face in this field are obviously around climate change, and are obviously around public health crises that I never really fully envisioned. And I know I've been working with people in public health for years now. My brother actually works for the CDC, but I could not really conceptualize how something like this would play out. So, I'm concerned because I feel like it turns planning on it over its head, because everything we learn about in planning about like creating great public spaces and public transit and all of these things, I feel like those concepts and those ideas are threatened a little bit. So I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but I think those are the things that pop up to me right now.
No, I appreciate that. I like to hear that there's optimism in the face of all these challenges. So thank you.
Well, and hey, you know, I'm in Texas, and we're working in small communities, and they're pretty conservative communities, but we're able to have conversations around these topics, and people in the communities are saying, yeah, I mean, that area over there didn't used to flood, you know, or we told that developer not to build down there because we knew it was the bottomlands. And now all those people are in those new homes are flooding, you know. So I guess I see the power of people, you know, ultimately what we all want is to leave something behind that is good for our next generation, for our children and their grandchildren. And those are the things that, like, for instance, the county judge in Liberty County, that's what he said. He's like, I want to leave behind a community that I would be proud for my grandchildren to live in. That's sustainability. That's resilience, you know, and what can we do to foster that and create that environment. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to ask about sort of, you know, as you mentioned, you know, the coronavirus has sort of thrown everything on its head. But one of the articles I read recently sort of mentioned how this is sort of a microcosm for the larger sort of mitigation things we need to do during climate change. So has there been anything you've learned that you think we can apply to sort of the greater mitigation effort that we have moving forward, especially in the next, you know, 10, 20 years, to really, you know, trying to prevent those, you know, prevent the sort of crazy effects? Because we've mentioned in this course before that because climate change is something so minute and so far away, people have problems conceptualizing it, but this might be a good way, you know, to help bridge that gap. So what do you think you can sort of apply from this time? Like, what have you learned about, you know, possibly doing those steps?
Yeah. So the thing that comes to mind when you say that is, you know, so obviously I was just talking about Rockport, and they were just devastated in 2017. And I feel like they're just now kind of getting back on their feet, right? And that community is a fishing community, and it's a tourist community. And I am very worried about all those little mom and pop shops that are down there right now, because they, like I said, they just got back on their feet. So the things I think about, and I think the things that they're probably thinking about are, you know, how can we have, I mean, I don't know if this is what you want your answer to be, but like, how can we have a diverse economy so that these shocks are not so dramatic, you know, that, you know, if nobody is going to retailers and nobody is doing tourism, that our community doesn't just completely die. So like what, and they did say that in the plan, they in wanting a diverse economy. So I think I haven't really fully, I know it's only been a few, it's kind of been like a month now, but I haven't really fully grasped like the implications of this for our field in the built environment and thinking about mitigation. I definitely think, you know, this is an opportunity for us to make those connections between planning and public health, which has been, it's always been there, right? Planning has and public health have kind of come up together. I don't have a good answer for you. You know what I have thought about though is what Phil is going to talk about next week, the Plann Integration for Resilience scorecard. I think there's a way for us to also assess plans based on how we are thinking about public health. So how could this be the Plann Integration for Public Health scorecard, or what are the policies in place that are inhibiting us in all these areas, you know, in future calamities that we can think about, whether they're natural hazards or pandemics or just global upheaval because of climate change, immigration influxes because of climate change, and refugees from areas that are impacted more by climate change. I don't know. Those are, I don't know if you want to add to that, or anyone else, feel free to add to that, but just things that are, I'm rambling at this point, so I'll stop.
Thank you very much. Again, it's a very big question, so I understand why
Yeah.
that I've started thinking about, because of how, you know, how things have changed so rapidly, but how similar it is to sort of the climate issues that we've been talking about for a long time. The effects are very similar on like a smaller scale.
Right, and people are going to be talking about this for generations, right? And I think it can allow us to have conversations about this in communities that we might not have had before. You know, like, can we use this as, well, what happened in your community during, you know, COVID-19? What if that happens again? And how can we create a scenario for us to be more resilient to climate change shocks as well? I don't know, but yeah, good, very good question.
Thank you very, very much.
I have a question building off of that, kind of. Just like in situations where, like we're in right now, where the harm being done to communities is like really due to like macro level societal lack of like safety nets. So how do you kind of balance like staying really community focused and specific while also still thinking about really like national and even international like systemic issues?
Yes, I think, you know, when we, the county judge in Liberty County, he talked about that this community used to be all rice fields. And he talked about in the 70s, there was this rice embargo globally, and it changed the price of rice. And all of a sudden, overnight, all of these farmers, they couldn't farm for rice anymore. And it created, you know, a situation where a lot of folks were, didn't have jobs or income in that particular community, and trying to figure out how to survive. And now the community is not rice fields, it's lots of different things. And then there's lots of growth and development pressure in that area. And so things have changed. But I think that's a really hard challenge, and probably something a lot of communities are concerned with and thinking about. And you're probably thinking about them in terms of your own careers and your own jobs. Dang it, you have such good questions. I think that, you know, it's at the fundamental, fundamentally, communities want community. They want to be resilient. They want to be safe. They want things for their kids and grandkids to have and hold on to. I don't want to underestimate Americans' desire to earn a buck, though, you know, and I do think that we're ultimately pretty resilient people when you think of it in that term. But it's challenging, and we haven't yet had to have those conversations quite at this level yet in our program. So maybe it's a piece I can write up after we have some of those conversations. yeah, I do feel like rural and low capacity places feel like things just happen to them and they don't have control. Those are the types of things that they have said to us before. And the way we try to think about it and we frame it when we're having conversations with them and doing visioning processes with them is to focus on your assets and focus on the things that you've got right and that are good right now. And so if we can focus on the assets, other things can fall in line. John Cooper, like I said, he talks about a community that in North Carolina that had like these purple sweet potatoes, and I don't know if you know of this community, but there was a farmer and a few farmers that were growing these purple sweet potatoes, and then now they're known across the country for having these purple sweet potatoes, and they marketed their whole community around that. And all the fanciest restaurants are wanting to use these purple sweet potatoes, and they have this purple sweet potato festival. And maybe that's not the best example right now, since we don't really have restaurants open and that kind of, and festivals. But we always try to focus on the assets first, so asset-based community development, and starting there as the framework. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Thanks.
Yeah, I will say we're also exploring how to do virtual engagement and having those conversations. We're testing out doing Zoom through Facebook Live. And so we're going to be having some virtual community meetings coming up soon. So I'm interested to see how that all plays out, and the types of responses and the types of questions we're going to get from folks in that format as well.
All right, are there any other questions? All right, so thank you very much, Jaimie, for joining us. And you can stop recording now.
Oh, yep. Let me figure out how to do that.